Активные мероприятия, говорите? Будущее покажет. Добро пожаловать на виртуальный саммит UpCode.
I will be talking about the first hack, forge, leak operation. Often people forget the middle aspect here, the forging. There are obviously hack and leak cases, but some of the most significant instances contain elements of forgeries. Context here is, of course, that the entire disinformation conversation is at the top of the news agenda these days. And I thought we should really put this particular instrument of hacking and leaking into historical context. So that's what I'm going to do today. The point of departure here is that really to understand cyber operations in the 21st century, we first have to understand intelligence operations in the 20th century. That, of course, also applies to covert action, if you like, disinformation, or what CIA called political warfare in the 1950s. We have to understand how the logic of this activity worked in the pre-internet age to really appreciate what's going on today. And this is not just a historian's gimmick, me saying this. I say this because for the old cases, we have the memos, we have the original project proposals, the approval, the authorizations, the budget requests, etc. So we can learn an incredible amount of, we get a lot of insight from these cases that we just don't have if we look at the digital output, at the exhaust of these operations. So let me give you a quick example of what I think is perhaps the most stunning forgery and leak that we saw in the Cold War. It came to the it started in the late 60s already, but really came to the fore in the 1970s. It was replayed, the same forgery, more than 20 times over at about a dozen years, and you will understand why in just a moment. Suddenly, in 69, around Christmas time, a Norwegian socialist newspaper called Orientering was first surfacing top secret American war plans under a Christmas tree. The story didn't really catch on then. It was picked up again by a far left German magazine called Konkret. A link to, anyway, it doesn't matter. But even then, the story didn't really catch on. We have the full leak. I was able to track it down from the end of the 1970s, and here's the cover page of the full leak of all the documents that KGB leaked at the time, more than 120 pages, most of them top secret documents. So the first question when the leak surfaced was, where on earth does this come from? So I'll answer that question in a moment, but let's quickly look at an interesting forgery that is in there. In that stack of paper, in those 120 pages, there was one page that looked like this, top secret. It looked genuine, and it had suggestions on edits, how to make changes to existing top secret documents. And it contained this paragraph here that I'm going to zoom into that talked about the release authority of nuclear weapons. And if you read this in context, it becomes clear that this is not the real thing. It's a very unrealistic thing that they suggest in that paragraph. It's underlined. The U.S. Army doesn't underline in this document, in those documents at the time, and the entire tone of the whole of the edits page is just off. And you can tell if you read a bunch of these documents, you can tell that something isn't quite right. But it's a very high quality forgery. It's easy to fall for the forgery, and that's indeed what happened. They mailed out the forgery with the help of a defector, a German defector actually, in Moscow, and mailed it from Rome to a number of journals, and one Italian journal, ABC at the time, also a far left political magazine that sort of weirdly combined explicit adult content with, in this case, military planning and political scandals more broadly. You can see the headline at the top. They use these cheap journalistic outlets because they reached a large number of people, and the quality of the journalistic work was, lower than in other more highbrow journals. So it was quite helpful to have this, this weird combination of sex and scandal. Let me just give you what happened in Germany, because it's the most extraordinary thing. In Germany, the operation here played out in weekly magazines as well. And I would just point out that KGB surfaced the operation to Stern, which is also often with explicit content at the time, which ran with a story and completely bought the framing that was provided in that fake document page that I just showed you. Then Der Spiegel, which is a more serious, slightly more highbrow weekly magazine, also run out of Hamburg, also received the documents but did something else. They turned the disinformation story itself into the story. You can see the disinformation here on the in the story itself. This is from Spiegel, not Stern. Now, the Spiegel here also revealed, and you can see the face of this gentleman here, Robert Lee Johnson. Here, Der Spiegel revealed the actual source, namely a Russian spy in the US Army in the 1960s. That's him. So the Spiegel did something extraordinary. They authenticated the source of the documents, and that was breaking, news, completely fresh reporting, extremely well done on their part, which then confronted KGB with a fascinating dilemma. They basically had pushed information out, partly forged but mostly correct. Some journals fell for it, others exposed them. So what do you do next? So KGB decided, okay, let's double down. Let's reward Stern, the German magazine that ran with their story, and send them more documents, this time even more explosive documents. And they sent nuclear yield requirement lists, top secret American war plans that I was able to track down. And this is a target listing here that contains, you can see it contains West German targets, West German cities as nuclear targets. Obviously a massive story that that Stern now knew came from KGB, because the story had just broken. But they also knew this was huge in terms of, media newsworthiness. So they decided to publish again, this time knowingly spreading information that came from a hostile intelligence agency, and assuming the information was correct. I think correctly assuming that the information was correct and not forged. So the operation started out with a forgery, covert, then turned into an overt operation without a forgery, as far as we know. Operational adaptation on the part of KGB here. So let's move forward to the present. And I'm going to give you just one case study that echoes with this one. And I'll do that in just a few minutes. The anonymous movement pops up in the early 2000s, which is an important piece of context here. What also pops up is the phenomenon of leaking becomes something positive. WikiLeaks, of course, Cablegate, the big State Department leak, and of course, Edward Snowden become cultural icons, something that is, to many people, obviously not to all, but to many people, something positive. So leaking becomes suddenly synonymous almost with transparency. And of course, this is perfect. If you're sitting in Russian foreign intelligence, and you see the rise of leaking as a cultural phenomenon, you're like, oh my God, this is the best. We now have a website. We can just push out content camouflaged as anonymous activism and run operations this way, which is exactly what happened next. In March 2014 in Ukraine, you can see in that picture, at the time, Lieutenant Colonel Jason Gresh, U.S. Army Foreign Area Officer based in Kiev in the embassy, explaining something to Ukrainian officers here. Then suddenly on an anonymous website, this leak pops up. Anonymous Ukraine hack correspondent of U.S. Army attaché assistant in Kiev and discover plot against Ukraine. Now, when I found this, I got excited. This is a picture of one of the Ukrainian kernels, because the text of that anonymous post, let's look at it a little more closely, mentions that Jason Gresh, the American officer, writes to Igor Protsik. This is a picture of Igor Protsik, a Ukrainian senior officer in the general staff. And they also contain the file links here. They're not active anymore when I find this, but they contain the name of this leak. And I'm like, oh, this is exciting. Surely I will be able to find this leak somewhere. So I turned to the internet, and here it gets a little exciting, because it turns out it's really hard to find the Protsik leak. The file sharing links are not online anymore, not active anymore. I can't find the actual file. I can't retro hunt on VirusTotal because it's way too long ago. So what can I do? So finally, I find a hash in some dark internet forum. I find a hash that corresponds to the file name. And I managed to pull up the actual leak. You can see it's the Protsik 7z file from VirusTotal with the help of the hash. And it's interesting because the first submission is exactly 1 day after it appeared on that anonymous forum. So I found the leak. So let's look at it. Amazingly, the people who went in and obviously forged emails that were not actually in Protsik's inbox, so they hacked Igor Protsik's inbox, Gmail inbox, and did not discover anything interesting in that inbox. It was simply, flight bookings and some travel reservations and whatnot. Nothing of real interest. A few emails from Jason Gresh, but nothing actually of interest to Protsik. So they say, okay, let's just copy paste some of the headers, change some of the ID numbers in the headers, and just come up with emails that are more interesting. So they literally forge 3 emails, put them into a folder called Most Interesting, and leak the emails. And indeed, it is most interesting. At that point, I get really excited and start looking at the emails more specifically. So there's a sequence of 3 emails. There's Jason Gresh. This is fake Jason Gresh, just to be clear, instructing the Ukrainian general staff to attack an air base in the, actually just abstractly instructing them to go forward with their plan. And the entire language in the email is completely weird. So obviously, to anybody who understands, who's ever studied, interacted with senior officers in the US or NATO or anything, you instantly can tell this email, it's a very bad fake, unlike the one in the 70s. This is really badly done. Next email is from Protsik to a local commander in eastern Ukraine, and finally the plan to attack an airbase. So here I just want to sort of tease out what's going on. We have here an extremely convoluted forgery. The forgery is that an American colonel instructs the Ukrainian general staff to attack a Ukrainian airbase and frame the Russians. So this is basically a conspiracy to frame Russia in attacking Ukraine. But of course, the whole thing is basically a conspiracy folded into another conspiracy. And this is helpful because it just shows you the depth of essentially of conspiratorial planning going on here. Writing this book really messed with my mind because initially I thought, well, of course this can't be true because it's way too convoluted. This is must be conspiracy. But then, of course, you've come across these weirdly complex plots like this one, and you're like, okay, this is just odd. What happened next is interesting. The story gets pushed out by Russian state media, Voice of Russia at the time, now Sputnik, or formerly part of it. You have here a video that is put out, camouflaged as anonymous, just turning the story into something, trying to blow up that forgery, that story. Just one final observation on this weird forgery here. It was The forgery was not particularly well done. So a lot of people in the US government, in the US embassy, assumed that this would not have a major effect because it was so obviously badly done. But if you talk to the Ukrainian general staff about the operation, they are less sure. They basically say, okay, listen, you need to understand this in its actual context. Igor Protsik, the victim of the forgery here and the hack, he told me that, I'm paraphrasing, he said, listen, I went to Soviet military school. I was taught to run operations like this. So the Ukrainian general staff, I understand, assumed that they were looking at a GRU operation here, but they also understood, I think, that the operation, although it was not particularly shrewd, especially the English language part, was effective against the population in southeastern Ukraine, because they were not used to seeing Ukrainian armored personnel carriers and army personnel on the ground. So there was a lot of distrust that this operation tried to exploit. So don't judge an operation based on the lack of its sophistication, either technically or indeed in terms of its execution more broadly. Yes, I will close just by observing that in early 2014, the operational pace really turns up. We have another leak forge operation just a couple of weeks later in the context of the Ukrainian elections in May 2014, where the election results of the Ukrainian Election Commission were forged. This is also a forgery that was pushed out to the media pretty aggressively at a critical moment. I think I will stop here and start taking a few questions, and maybe we can tease out some other aspects of the operation in the Q&A. Oh, I will make one quick observation. I tried to confirm that Igor Protsik was targeted by, APT28 or Fancy Bear, however you want to call them, through known databases that contain listings of targets. There are several. Not all of them are widely known. One of them is the famous Bitly data that were created, the target list that were created because they made a mistake in the link shortening of phishing emails. Protsik is not in that particular database. I was unable to find his particular email in other company repositories and companies who track this operation. If any of you can have access to early APT28 targeting data, I'd be interested in checking. But I think most companies started tracking a little later in 2014. So that's the explanation most likely. Yeah, thank you for your attention for now.
Thanks, Thomas. Yeah, definitely one question before we start with the questions from the chat. What's that dark obscure form that you were mentioning at the beginning? It feels like it's an interesting detail that you just purposely omitted.
I'm sorry. Where's the? I didn't understand the question. I apologize.
Oh, sorry. What is the form that you were mentioning? The dark obscure form. Where you found the hash? Yeah.
Yeah. Great question. I tried to reconstruct how I found the hash at the time, and I, to be blunt, I forgot. I couldn't pull it up again, so I apologize. But that doesn't mean the evidence is not good.
Okay. It just sounded more cool to say it was an obscure form.
Yes.
Okay. A question from Ryan. When you're writing a book, how do you know when it's done, and how do you decide when it's the right time to stop?
Oh, wow. That's a tough question. Well, if your publisher's breathing down your neck with a deadline, that certainly helps to decide when to stop. In this case, it was hard to decide when to stop, because when I started writing this book about the history of disinformation, I thought, surely can I really fill like a thick book with this story? And very quickly it became clear, oh my God, I could write two at least books about this. So I had to make a selection. Obviously, that was difficult.
Oh yeah, I mean, if you do a history of disinformation, yeah, definitely it's an encyclopedia in a few volumes, because there's
Yeah.
I mean, actually, I have another question. What are your thoughts about, like, like for disinformation? We do hear a lot about Russia. It keeps coming back, like for the past 5-6 years. We do hear a lot about Russia. Are you planning to write about other countries in the near future, or why do you think people are also talking so much about Russia? What are your opinion about it?
Yeah, that's a great question. The book is not just about Russian operations. I portray a number of very extensive American operations, East German operations, Bulgarian, Czech operations, of course, and Soviet. But of course, Russia more recently has started in the most visible way. But if you go just 1 year forward from May 2014, some of you, I'm sure you have heard of the Wiki Saudi leaks case, the alleged Yemen cyber army leak of Saudi foreign ministry files that pops up in 2015, around June 2015. That's a difficult one to attribute, because there are forensic indicators that point to two alternative explanations. Either it's a Russian operation or an Iranian operation, or some sort of weird combination of both. And it looks to me personally, I've changed my assessment in this case based on new evidence, and I think it's not unlikely that it's actually an Iranian operation, at least in part. And it's a fascinating case to look at. Iran was active in this space quite early as 2011. And certainly escalated since.
Yeah, that makes sense. Another question is, what are your thoughts about the nature of disinformation related to COVID-19, namely the suggestion that China is adopting Russian tactics?
Yeah, that's a tough one, because, of course, the scholar and the researcher in me is very cautious at this point, because I can only see some of the output of operations. And, writing this history made me very cautious, because as soon as the Cold War ends, we just don't have access to the memos anymore, to the actual files. And, assessing the operation that I just described is actually really hard, because I don't have really high quality forensics or high quality documents to prove anything here. So in the COVID case, that of course is also true. Having said that, some Chinese state media put out information, or campaigns almost. Some of you may have seen this video of the comic of the Statue of Liberty talking to a Chinese nurse about the crisis COVID response. That's a pretty impressive piece of advertising, if you like, on the Chinese government's part. So they're certainly getting aggressive, but I think it's worth highlighting that most of what they do is very ham-fisted, very clumsy, almost as clumsy as what we see from the U.S. administration, of course.
Yeah, actually, a side comment from Kostin Ryu. I guess everyone is adapting or adopting those old school, oldies but goldies tactics nowadays. For instance, Czech lab Durtegan. I guess that's true, yeah.
I think when the internet really became a big thing in the 1990s and early 2000s, there was a lot of utopianism and optimism. And I think even the InfoSec community today, although many of us are so cynical, we are still influenced by that extraordinary amount of optimistic thinking. I think we should, in my mind, still expect more forgeries, we should be more distrustful than we already are. I think that's a personal lesson that I took away from studying that history. So it's not necessarily going back to old school tactics. These tactics were always used. It's just that we haven't forgotten about them in the meantime.
Yeah, it's true. People do have a short memory. There is a question. It's a bit long. It's probably written by an academic, so I may have to read it twice. In your book, you mentioned that disinformation resists metrics. If more data generally meant more reliable metrics, then the internet had the reverse effect on the old art of political warfare. In this light, is there a way to measure disinformation?
I think the logic of most disinformation active measures is that they take existing prejudices, existing often facts, and the operation that I described from the 1970s is a brilliant example. There was a genuine fear of nuclear war in the 1970s in Germany, in France, elsewhere, everywhere. So that was perfect for disinformation because you could tap into that existing fear and exacerbate it. So how do you measure by how much you exacerbated something that is already powerful? I don't think there's any measurement device that we have for this. And the technology that we use doesn't change anything. It's a psychological dynamic.
Yeah, I mean, we can see like for like threat intelligence related to disinformation are still pretty weak. A few weeks ago, we had Sarah Jen from Coxsec Lab that was explaining the work they're doing with the it's similar to like the MITRE attack framework, but just for disinformation. It's called Amit, and basically to have like a framework where at least you could leverage like existing threat intelligence platform that we use for malwares, where you could like start to index like disinformation campaign, at least like to have more information that can be like searchable, which is also one of the problem now. Like you say, like you have to go on random forums, and it's very difficult to keep track of where you get the information. And something if you hear something, I mean, I guess especially for disinformation.
There's so many. What I find so fascinating about studying active measures is that you come across contradictions all the time, because active measures are ultimately about exacerbating contradictions. That's the whole premise. And one of them is on metrics. So, for example, although it is still, I would argue, impossible to measure the effect, it is possible to measure the lack of effect. Because you do have metrics for something that didn't happen. So I think paradoxically, we can show that operations have failed. It's just hard to show how well they have succeeded, because you would have to run a counterfactual experiment in order to come to that answer. And then the other one is that, of course, for attribution, technology and specific indicators and forensics can be extremely helpful. So we can have a faster attribution cycle than we had in the past. Also, we can have faster operational adaptation than we had in the past. So there are a number of interesting changes, no question.
Yeah, I mean, you could argue that the fast attribution factor is also a bad thing, because people are very quick to point like fingers at countries. So for sure, at some point, it's going to be abused. If it's not already abused, we start to see, I mean, it's been like almost like 10 years. People are talking about it for malware, when people started to be like, oh, it's really trendy to just like, like the attribution dice type of thing, where like you just roll it and just like read the country that's under the dice. There's no way, like, especially for something as old as disinformation, that people are just not like, well, we know like those countries are using those tactics. Well, what about we just simulate it and do that? Like, I think like, was it today or yesterday, like Facebook just released the new report for like CIB. I mean, if I recall correctly, there is a campaign in Mauritania that was involving a paid campaign of almost $200, so because we don't have any information about, oh, they get it, like I was telling a friend, I was like, I'm almost tempted to like start to run like some like, well, obviously you can, because like you're probably gonna get in trouble with law enforcement, but like to like run like fake campaigns to see if they're gonna come up with like some random attribution, So
absolutely. I mean, but on the attribution side, maybe also history can be a little helpful there, because we should not assume that if you have an active measure that you're trying to attribute, the controversy will not go away, even if you have extremely high quality forensic indicators and data available. Even if you have certainty, in attribution, that doesn't mean the debate will go away, because the actual prejudices, the raw material that helped the active measure to succeed, also means that the controversy will continue no matter how good the evidence is. That was also the case in the past.
Oh, definitely.
So we shouldn't assume that we will convince anybody.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, because like you said, in a lot of cases, like attribution is there, and we know which country is doing what, and they've been doing it for like decades, and it does not change much to the narrative. I just don't want them countries to not get in trouble with people, but yeah.
I mean, sorry.
No, keep going. I was about to jump to another question, saying, so if you have another comment, go ahead.
Just quick comment. I think the narrative, we can change the dominant narrative, and I think it matters what people of influence say, and you can change the minds of a significant number of people. In fact, whether somebody is willing to change their mind based on new evidence, to me, is one of the most interesting questions, because those people who don't have the capacity and the willingness to change their mind based on new evidence, I just don't take them seriously. So changing that is a key feature. Anybody who does investigations will intuitively understand what I mean. You have to be able to take new evidence on board.
Another question is hoping to get hands on your book. Besides similarities, what differences between 20C offline and 21C online operations would you point out? I don't know what's 20C offline and 21C online. So if you can also explain to...
probably 20th century offline and 21st century online operations, what the difference is.
Okay. That makes sense.
I'll just make a big observation here. So 21st century leaks have a much higher volume. I mean, 120 pages was large in the 1970s. It's tiny, today. So what does the volume of leaks imply? And the answer there is, I think, one thing is that if you do a small leak, and that includes forged documents also, then you really have to it's very crafty. You have to really know what you're doing. It takes handiwork, it takes skill, it's like artisanal, really. And if you do a leak that is high volume, mostly true, maybe only has a few false cover stories involved, like claiming it's from the DNC, while in fact it's not from the DNC, which was actually the case. That is very industrial scale leaking. You just put out a lot of content, and the value add is not your artisanal craftsmanship. The value add is created by journalists and other researchers going in and then turning the leak in, finding the interesting tidbits. So, Matt, I'm going to provoke you. In a way, shadow brokers weaponized you because you went in and found some of the really interesting stuff in there. But I think they also weaponized me, so you're not alone there.
You mean like for the NSA Swift thing?
Yeah.
No, definitely. I mean, like, just to elaborate on that, actually, funny enough, coincidence or not, I got a bunch of journalists from like Sputnik News and RT who were like reaching out for me, like from time to time for comments on stories. And after a while, like after one story, I was like, oh no, I'm not really that interested to like comment on this, and then like all of them stopped at the same time. And when I was supposed to go to Russia last year to give a keynote at Zero Night, I got denied of entry at the border because my visa was quote unquote invalid, but I had a visa with me. So coincidence, I mean, there are a bit of like unrelated events, or they're all related, but regarding the weaponization of things, definitely. Although I still think like the document on the NSA thing was pretty cool, because retrospectively, if you look back, that's, like all the things related to double pulsar and everything were like used in that actual like release. And that's what like gave birth to like WannaCry and NotPetya and all those things. So
That's a fact.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the last chapter in my book is on shadow brokers, and I think I'll cut right to the chase. We just don't know who was behind shadow brokers. It could have been an intelligence operation. It could also have been an insider, a form of insider operation or leak or insider threat type situation. But the fact is that Russian actors took advantage of the story in public and private ways.
Yeah, no, definitely. Especially like amplifying an existing narrative is usually what works the best, because if you have to like orchestrate like something from A to Z, it's way too much work. So you're better off keeping your eyes open, especially if you have a fixed agenda. You're going to have plenty of opportunities. Like you say with Snowden, like leaks became kind of like the cool thing to do. They kind of knew like more would came up after. Although like some people like don't agree with the connection of saying Snowden kind of like gave birth to like that generation of like whistleblowers. But yeah. Another question, just to like move on to another topic. Is Netflix an active measure campaign?
Netflix?
Yeah. I mean, probably not an active measure campaign, but I guess like one of the topic that's coming in the chat is that sometimes it does feel like Netflix has an agenda. So if you think about it, if you want to spread a message instead of, actually I was thinking of doing some research on it, but it's very hard to like just like gather all the data, is instead of like posting like tweets or Facebook posts or even YouTube videos, because obviously YouTube is used for disinformation. If you can get like your documentary or like TV show like validated by Netflix, because it comes up from like it looks legit, you have like an actual team, etc. But then you can like kind of move the messaging around it, or even like have like subtitles that are like erroneous in certain languages. For instance, like there is a Mossad documentary. I remember I even tweeted about it. In one of the English subtitles, it was saying death to Israel when they were talking about Iran and how evil Iran was. But then if you listen to the sound, it said something about Allah. So I went on YouTube to find like that exact same speech, and it was just basically something like glory to Allah, and in the English version it was translated as death to Israel. And it was like more than a year ago, like almost 2 years ago. And from that moment, I was like, actually, like Netflix would be a great platform to like push a message, because even if you look at even non-political subject like veganism, all those things, like you get like every time there is like a cooking show or something, like you have like 10 people around you talking about it, like Tiger King, for instance, like everyone is talking about it. It's probably like the most successful documentary like about it, whereas like if you push something on YouTube, like, or even on Twitter, it's gonna be a lot of work to get like your audience, because there's more noise. Whereas like if you can like tailor it for like platform like Amazon Prime and Netflix, is Netflix the Radio Free Europe of the 21st century?
Well, I would, I'll make a big but I think absolutely crucial observation here, and that is, if we study disinformation operations, if you study active measures are actual conspiracies, small conspiratorial operations, sometimes longer conspiratorial projects, not conspiracy theories, but actual projects that have a conspiratorial purpose. Now, I'm using these weird terms here to make a big point, and the point is, if you start believing in those projects and start exaggerating their effect and their power, which is something that operators tended to do again and again because it was good for their, they got more money, got promotions, got prizes and whatnot internally. Then you run the risk of becoming an actual conspiracy theorist. So what I mean by that is that basically disinformation should not be exaggerated, because disinformation about disinformation is disinformation. Sorry to go all academic on you, or
no, of course, yeah.
It's so what it means is, if you study this for people like you and me, really, in some cases, it means we have to be extremely cautious and rigorous with the evidence, and often question assumptions that we make, and be just and come to the conclusion sometimes that probably the assumption that we just made is wrong.
No, definitely. Thanks. I guess
Thank you.
That's it for now. There's some more questions in the chat. If you have a look after, I'm sure you can see them.
Thank you so much.
But thanks again for joining us.